Hello and welcome to Filibustering History, a podcast series where we discuss what historians do with their lives. I'm Rob Denning, lead faculty for the history program at Southern New Hampshire University's College of Online and Continuing Education. Today I'm interviewing David Numme, an associate dean of faculty for STEM at SNHU. Yep, that's right, STEM. There's been a lot of talk lately about the applicability of skills learned in history and other liberal arts to a variety of careers, and Dave is a perfect example of how this works. Today we will talk about his background a bit, including an undergraduate degree in history, the role that history plays in his everyday life, and how the skills that he learned in his history degree and afterwards translate to his day job in a very different field. What is your name and what do you do?
Hi, my name is Dave Numme. I am Associate Dean of Faculty and Graduate STEM at Southern New Hampshire University, and what this means is that I have the privilege of leading the graduate STEM, which stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Management, instructors in the online school here at SNHU.
And what is your academic and professional background?
I have an undergraduate degree in history education. After I earned that, I taught in small private school for a few years, and I taught everything from history to math to what became my adopted field of computers, and I taught that from elementary through college level. And after that, I decided to stop teaching for what I thought was going to be a few years. Turned out to be a little longer than that, but because I wanted to get some practical hands-on experience in my adopted field of IT or information technology. So I've worked in various IT roles, and history has been a wonderful hobby on the side and something that I have kept up with, but not in a professional capacity. My new hobby since completing my MBA has been to judge different robotics events that my two children are participate in.
So you said that your undergraduate degree was in history. What specific fields were you interested in?
It was initially American history, but between my sophomore and junior year in undergrad, I had the privilege of spending a year in Cambridge, England. And prior to going, medieval history was just boring, and quite frankly, so was ancient history. It was the part of history that I enjoyed the least. But then I had the privilege to go see it. Got to go to the British Museum or be walking through London, which became one of my favorite places to go. And then you see segments of the Roman wall still standing. I got to visit many castles and cathedrals. And then once I got to see it, once I got to experience it, history, that portion of history became alive to me. And since then, I have taken to visiting Civil War battlefields. So that area has become interesting to me as well.
And so you've been visiting Civil War battlefields. Which ones have you visited so far?
The list is long. I have visited, my first trip was to Vicksburg in Mississippi. Quite an incredible experience. Been to Gettysburg a couple times. My family and I went on the 149th anniversary, got to see Doris Kearns Goodwin give an amazing speech the night before the event. They had the lighting of the luminaries where they had candles around the soldiers' graves. My two daughters, prior to that, got to help place American flags around it, and it was one of the most incredible experiences. Matter of fact, even as I tell this story, I get goosebumps, but at night on the quarter hour with just candles lighting the soldiers' graves, you would hear taps coming, and it was an incredibly special experience. I visited Manassas. The list is long.
That's great. And so you would classify, at least so far, your interest in history. I mean, you were interested enough to get an undergraduate degree, but obviously your interest in history has been lifelong. Even though you're not pursuing a professional career in history, it is still something that has stuck with you for your entire life so far.
It is. I'm not a formal historian. I just enjoy it, but I can't help but wonder if it's somewhat genetic, because my father has an undergraduate degree in political science, and even though my dad did not say, not that any parent can say this, you will like history, I found as a child, I remember reading every single book I could find on Abraham Lincoln, and I was born in Florida, and when I was 8, we moved to Minnesota. My parents made a special detour to Springfield to see President Lincoln's home because they recognized that I had such a great interest. And then when a number of years later we moved to Alaska, and once again I read every single book that I could find on the history of Alaska and the bush pilots, and it was pretty incredible. And what's interesting is that I have two daughters, and my youngest daughter has the same interest, and it wasn't something that I've tried to cultivate, but it's been like watching my life play out in front of me because she also has the same interest of President Lincoln. So just like my parents did for me, a few years ago we actually took a trip and we visited President Lincoln's birthplace in Kentucky. We went to his home in Indiana, and then later also on the same trip to his last home in Springfield. And then I think it was last summer, the summer before, I took her over to Hildene in Vermont, where his only surviving son has a home. Rob, you could probably explain this better than I, but it's just kind of interesting to see how that works in families. So
yeah, my poor son has two very overeducated parents, and that poor kid is going to be subjected to from my side it's history, from my wife's side it's science, and so that poor kid doesn't have a chance. He's going to like this stuff whether he likes it or not.
Yeah, which is good. I think that's really neat because you're and actually it's the same way interestingly with my family, because my wife is a science person, I'm a history person, but it's not like I tried to force feed history. It's almost like it's in our genes or our DNA or something. I don't know how it works, but it's fascinating to see it play out.
Right. Well, that's great that you've I mean, from a purely selfish perspective, that's great that you're still interested in history, because I wish more people were. So you mentioned numerous times, of course, that your day job is in a field that is very different from history. I mean, you've said that you're interested in information technology, you have an MBA, you're part of the STEM program at SNHU. So how do you think the skills that you learned as an undergraduate historian, and then just, skills that you've picked up as, I don't want to say amateur historian pejoratively, but you're not in a formal history position. So the skills that you've picked up as a historian during your undergraduate career and afterwards, how do you think those skills manifest themselves in your current field?
One of my undergraduate history instructors, he's a gentleman by the name of Mark Miller, strongly instilled in me the value of going to the original source. So when I was an undergrad and writing history papers, he would say, your paper is going to be far better if you get it as close as you can to the original source. So you look at what the people themselves say, are not people that were writing about it 200 or 300 years later, but get as close to the source. And that is, interestingly, something that has actually helped me in my IT career, because when people present a computer problem, not that anybody would intentionally mislead or be somewhat untruthful, but I've taken that same lesson that Mark taught me and say, well, can you show me or can you replicate those steps? Or even today in my role here at SNHU, when I hear about a situation, I want to go and look at it myself. So that's the amateur historian, which is actually something that I take with pride, coming up in me. It's like I want to go as close to the original source. It's also taught me critical thinking skills, and quite frankly, without strong critical thinking skills, I dare say it's almost impossible to be effective in a information technology role. It's also given me a broader perspective to help me think big picture, help me think long term, help me to look for the patterns. I think it was somebody who said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does run in cycles or something like that. You probably know the phrase better than I do. So.
Yeah, there's the cliche that, if you don't understand history, you're condemned to repeat it. Mm-hmm. There's that type of thing, but there's actually been a lot of discussion about that. Some historians say that, well, it's not circular, but it's kind of a spiral shape. Or I think it was Mark Twain who said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Something like that.
Thank you.
Yeah,
that's what I was trying to remember. Thank you.
I don't remember if that's Mark Twain or not. It sounds like something he would say, so we'll go with that. Well, that's great. So you mentioned some important skills that you do in your everyday job: critical thinking, going to the original source. Do you see those skills as valued by other folks in your profession also? I mean, you've got this kind of background in history, so you've got it kind of built into your personality and your own personal interests. But do you see that type of thing as desirable among your peers in STEM or IT or any of those other fields?
I do. It's something that matter of fact, one of my colleagues that I work very closely with, Mark LePage, who's also a SNHU alum, he's Associate Dean of Programs here in STEM, and this is something that we talk about periodically, is the importance of having critical thinking skills. Something else that having a background in history has given me is the ability to think about technology from what I like to somewhat jokingly call the human perspective, and it just isn't merely the proverbial bits chasing the bytes. And something that people in my profession don't always do as well as they should is talk about technology or view technology from a more holistic perspective. So how can technology strategically or operationally benefit the organization? So having that strong liberal arts historical background helps me bridge the gap between my colleagues in information technology and my business colleagues. Gives me a broader perspective, a broader foundation. So I did a little research in preparation. Isn't that something that a historian likes to do, is do research?
All the time.
It is, and I wondered, is having this type of background, is that unique to me? Am I somebody special, or is this common? I know that informally a couple of colleagues, one of the senior IT directors here at SNHU, Steve Provost, used to be a history teacher before he went into information technology. Another colleague, Adam Goldstein, who is an instructor, or excuse me, an assistant professor at Champlain College in Vermont, and he also teaches cybersecurity courses for us here at SNHU. He enjoys history, so I've when we're on vacation recently, I met somebody who's a cybersecurity professional, but we spent more time talking about our favorite historical places that we had visited rather than our shared profession. But there's also some other notable names. Steve Case, who is the founder of America Online, has I believe, an undergraduate history degree. Stuart Butterfield, who's the founder of Slack, which is a really neat collaboration tool. His undergraduate degree is in philosophy, and he has a graduate degree in philosophy and the history of science. And I want to give you a direct quote from him. He said, "I learned how to write clearly. I learned how to follow an argument all the way down, which is invaluable in running meetings." So here's the leader of a very hot or prominent IT organization, Slack, but showing how his history, his liberal arts gave him the skills to help be successful in this. Carly Fiorani, who is the former CEO of HP, she earned a degree in medieval history at Stanford. Steve Yai, who is the chief executive officer at Media Alpha, which is a website company, who earned his degree in East Asian study at Harvard, said that liberal arts helped him to think multifacetedly. He learned how to think about things from different perspectives. And Susan, I apologize, I'm going to mispronounce her name, but Wojcicki, who's the CEO of YouTube, she earned her degree in history and literature. So as you can see, and the list goes on and on. There are many of our type, even though we don't necessarily think of these well-known IT leaders as having a degree in history, but you can see how it helped to make them successful in their field. Recently, I was talking with Dr. Gwen Britton, who's the executive director of STEM, about what's after STEM. STEM right now is a very important area for SNHU. It's our president and former President Obama talked about the need to have more STEM educated professionals. It seems like you can't go anywhere without seeing this. When I was in Halifax, Nova Scotia recently, I saw that in September of next year they're going to be having a STEM conference. But so it's the very hot thing. But what comes after this? And so I asked Dr. Britton this, and what she believes, and I absolutely agree, is that the people are going to be drawn back again to liberal arts, so that way they can properly understand the societal impacts of technology. So that this foundation is something that we will come back to, so that way we can understand what we've created and these marvelous technological inventions. But it gives us a more grounded, a more holistic view of the world and of life.
That's interesting. I have read articles, about tech guys talking about how they want to have liberal arts folks because of, like you said before, critical thinking skills and all of that. I haven't heard as much about the idea that we're going to want liberal arts type folks to really start to figure out what's the world going to look like and all of that. But that makes a lot of sense that when it comes time to, once we've got machines doing a huge proportion of the jobs that we have now, the world is going to look very different. And so it makes sense that you would like to have people that are trained with the type of thinking that can help make sense of the new world that we're going to be moving into. That's interesting. And obviously, as someone in the liberal arts, I think that's great news. I hope that becomes reality. But that is a really interesting idea. And I bet we will probably see a lot more of that kind of thinking as we go forward.
Absolutely. And it's we created these marvelous machines, and then they impact us, and then how do we deal with the impacts, the changing world? Something else I think about more and more is and how history benefits me in my profession is I've had a greater appreciation for what I call the wisdom of the ancients. Maybe that's a formal term and I'm borrowing it from somebody, but
it sounds like a Shakespeare type thing.
Okay. I'm not going to claim ownership, but it's something I think about more and more. And it's like, I as a good tech person, when the the latest technological invention comes out, I will admit there's still part of me that salivates. My pulse rate increases a little bit. It's like, isn't this cool? You almost get the little adrenaline rush. But as I step back and enjoy my history books or enjoy visiting historical places, I find myself gaining a greater and greater appreciation for the wisdom of the ancients. So even though they didn't have the Apple Watch that perhaps has more power than or computational power than the shuttle Columbia or something like that sitting on their wrist, our forebears were incredibly intelligent people, and they laid a foundation. And speaking personally, I don't always have the level of appreciation and gratitude for them that I should, because I get so caught up in the latest technical invention.
I agree, obviously. But yeah, it is. You think about the lives that we live today with all of our technological advances, and yeah, like you said, those smartphones, iPads, laptops. You and I are talking over computers. We are separated by a good 1,000 miles or so, but we're able to talk to each other in real time, which is kind of an amazing accomplishment, given that 100 years ago it just wasn't possible beyond maybe a telegraph or something. But it'd be very difficult to do this interview over a telegraph. But it is a very different world we live in. But at the same time, human nature has not changed all that much, and so it is probably going to be an interesting pursuit for future people in humanities and even in IT also, is to kind of figure out how does a much slower changing human nature going to interact with a very rapidly changing technological world that we live in. So that's going to open up all kinds of opportunities for future research projects, I think.
Absolutely. And to that point, I guess this is more of a sociology, not history, my apologies. But
that's all right.
There's actually a field of study about human factors. Usually it is human factors, things that people do that will cause the greatest vulnerabilities. It isn't like a machine sort of self-propagates and goes wild. It's a human person. So understanding what causes humans to do that, and then how can we prevent that? Because we need to keep our systems secure. So to your point, yes, you're right. I think it is going to be a study that will be going on for generations to come.
Well, that is something for us all to look forward to. I don't think we're going to solve that today, but it is something that we will all be keeping an eye on. So to wrap up here, do you have any history-related recommendations for us? A favorite book or an artifact or something that you've come across recently that you found particularly interesting?
The list is long. I've become a real fan of the national park systems, and the reason I like the national park system is you can go to the place where history happened. So we referenced earlier the various Civil War battlefields that visited the National Park Service creates this little $10 what they call a passport, and it's been fun to collect the stamps as I've been trying to see as many as I can. I did a couple of years ago read a book that I keep coming back to. It was by one of President Eisenhower's grandsons, called Going Home to Glory. This is part of the reason why I love history, and I love the leaders of history, particularly love reading about presidents, because I like presidents as much as great as they accomplished. They were humans just like you and I, and so this book, Going Home to Glory, gave me insight into the person of one of our great presidents, President Dwight Eisenhower. Then after I read the book, it inspired me on a subsequent trip to Gettysburg to go visit his home, which is on the corner of the Gettysburg battlefield. And having read the book, when I went to his home, I could almost see President and Mrs. Eisenhower sitting in the rocking chair in the living room, and things, I could almost imagine the conversations that President Eisenhower and Nikita Khrushchev had when they were at his home. So it's pretty neat. It's a good read.
Is this a biography of his entire life, or does it focus on a specific aspect of his life?
It mostly focuses on what David Eisenhower, who was one of President Eisenhower's son, his relationship with his grandfather. So as opposed to the Battle of D-Day or something like that. So this humanizes one of our great leaders.
Gotcha. Well, that sounds interesting. I will have to add that to my list. So thank you for your time, and I appreciate you talking to me today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Rob.
Great, thanks. And thank you to the listeners for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments on this podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please send me an email at snhuhistory@gmail.com. I'm Rob Denning. Thanks for listening.